Hello and welcome to episode 569 of the official EstablishTheRun.com podcast. My name is Adam Levitan. Today I am once again joined by two of the most thoughtful, insightful, no-sex-having best ball grinders on the planet. It is our own Best Ball Mania 1 champ, Justin Herzig, and Michael Leone, leader of our newfound analytics department, also author of the Best Ball Manifesto. Leone, how's it going today?
It's going pretty well. Excited to talk some advanced best ball strategies, peak nerdom.
Yes. In full transparency, we recorded the first 5 episodes of this podcast 7 to 10 days ago. By the end of that, nobody had enough energy for part 6. We wanted to save it for this very important one. Herzig, how's it going?
I think it says something that my boss calls me thoughtful, but my wife has never said that. Might mean we're a little too much into the weeds, into the fantasy football space, but yeah.
Definitely are too much into the weeds. If you guys want to see some serious virginity stuff on best ball, before you're following at Justin Herzig, at 2 hats, 1 mic. Okay. As I mentioned, today we are wrapping up our 6-part best ball series. Hope you all found this series helpful and enjoyable. If you did, we'd appreciate you tell a friend about the podcast. And if you're grinding best ball, you certainly need our Draft Kit Pro so you can upload our rankings to the sites and access all of our context around those rankings. Check out EstablishTheRun.com. Subscribe page. Draft Kit Pro is $49.99. On today's show, we're going to cover advanced and counterintuitive concepts in best ball. Once you have everything we talked about in part 1 down, once you have adapted your strategy for all the various sites, I think it's important to start exploring some outside the box stuff and perhaps some way outside the box stuff. Because as the best ball market gets sharper, the unique, the counterintuitive stuff will become almost necessary. So we are going to cover 7 things here today, 7 ideas that we have and how to implement them in our drafts. Start with number 1. This is one that is massively counterintuitive, would not have even crossed my mind until I heard Herzig and other people talking about it. 4 tight ends on 1 best ball team in an 18-round draft. Now, the tight end position is very, very difficult to get your head around. I think I thought last year elite tight end was correct. Unfortunately, I had a ton of Mark Andrews and a ton of Kyle Pitts. Did not work out. I don't think those are the kind of teams we're talking about here, Herzig. When we talk about 4 tight end teams, we're talking about waiting as long as possible, and then backfilling your roster with 4 tight ends. Herzig, where did this even come from? Because I wouldn't even, honestly, would not have even crossed my mind. And what do you think about this strategy?
Yeah, so a little context on this. For those who don't know, I've got a big heads-up bet in this best ball against Dan Zach, who is the 2022 WSOP Poker Player of the Year, so a really sharp guy. And it's a big bet, $50,000. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to start studying his lineups to get a better feel for like what he might be doing, what a sharp player is doing. And started realizing that he was doing some 4 and 5 tight end builds. And counterintuitive without a doubt. And more I started looking into it, delving into the data. First look at the data, 4 tight end teams, they advanced at a rate of 15.4%. So that's worse than average. That's not good. You look a little further, though, if it's 4 tight ends that are all drafted after round 13, so that's 4 of your last 5 picks, that now jumps up to 19.5%. That's a substantial increase compared to the expected of just under 17%. And when you look at overall advance rates, like that's substantial. Now, if you're also able to do it with like a smart aspect of last year, you wanted to go, hey, heavy wide receiver early, 3 last round tight ends plus 7 wide receivers had a 23.4%. So when we look into this, we have to figure out, okay, is this just, hey, any 3 tight ends we're going to do well if it was drafted at the end? Does the 4th tight end really help you? The more I looked into it, what I realized is that 4 tight ends is a very viable strategy if you're doing it in 4 of your last 5 picks. But if you also decide to just do 3 tight ends with your last 3 picks or 3 or last 4, it also had similar advance rates, 19.9% if you did 3 last round tight ends last year.
Let me say one thing. I get a little queasy about using only last year's data because let's say Kyle Pitts or Mark Andrews had a great year. Then those advance rates for the teams that took 3 or 4 tight ends very late would not be as good because they would not have Kyle Pitts or Mark Andrews. So I hate to keep coming back to the micro stuff, but when you're only looking back at last year, I get concerned that this is a hugely to do with how poorly the top of the position performed last year outside of Travis Kelce. You follow what I'm saying, Herzig?
Completely understand. And if you look at the article that I have on the clock, there's a link to a tweet by TJ Hernandez. You can see that 4 tight end builds have actually been plus EV strategy, plus EV builds across all 3 BBMs. Now, again, with the micro, the last 2 years, 3 of the top 6 tight ends were last round or late round tight ends. So this has been a theme the last 2 years. Is that going to repeat?
Right.
I'm not sure. I think there is a legitimate argument that those late tight ends, because even the ones being drafted now, those are starters. They have the chance to really finish in that top 7. But the argument against is it's still very hard to hit those true spike weeks in those late. So this is purely, I don't want to say purely, it is strongly an advance rate play. It may not be the best. It may be really hard to combat those elite tight ends in the actual playoff weeks, though.
Okay, Leone, I want to get your general take on this, but what comes to mind that makes sense with this is outside of Travis Kelce, everyone sucks at tight end. Let me just put, this is a DFS thing that I do all the time. Everybody sucks. They're all going to fail except for Kelce. So why not just wait and spend as little draft capital or as little salary in DFS as possible? So from that perspective, it makes sense to me. What do you think about that, Leone, and your general thoughts on this 4 tight end stuff?
Yeah, and what Herzig's saying, taking 4 tight ends the last 5 rounds, in my best ball manifesto, I broke down each pick and kind of assigned it a draft capital number based on how many points above positional average you get at that pick usually. And when you start getting to the 14th, 15th round, it's really like almost all these picks are such long shots to even contribute to your roster. So this is the one position similar to DFS. You talk about taking that min-price tight end. A lot of times we get min-price tight ends that are legitimate starters, and we don't have min-price wide receivers that are legitimate starters. So I think that's a big difference, is a combination of not over-investing in the middle tier of a position that systemically and historically just hasn't performed that well.
Right.
And then also you're getting actual starting players that can contribute to your roster late in the draft, whereas the running back and wide receiver picks at that point are much longer shots to even contribute to your roster at all. And hopefully you've shored up your running back and wide receiver earlier in the draft by not having to have to worry about tight end at all. So this puts less pressure on you. And let's say round 10, you don't have a tight end yet. And you're like, I take a Tyler Higbee or something here, who's he's got that base projectable volume. I mean, we do like him in our rankings, but maybe I need to grab another wide receiver here before wide receiver falls off a cliff, and I'll just wait. And it's not anytime there's a new strategy gets talked about a lot, maybe more than it's actually used. I don't think people should be using this a ton or going into your draft saying, I'm for sure going to use 4 tight ends. I think I've only done it once, since we've talked about it. And I've had some drafts where I've toyed with it and maybe I've been more flexible with how I've approached tight end because of it. But the one that I did last 4 rounds, I took Juwan Johnson, Dawson Knox, Tyler Conklin, Hayden Hurst. These are guys that are going to be on the field and playing. They can find the end zone, give you a spike week. You take one less wide receiver than you normally would. You're able to flex them if they just find the end zone on a given week. So I think there's merit to it, but it's not like something you're doing in more than, 10% of your drafts, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think it's more viable in 20-round drafts, right? DraftKings and other sites are 20-round drafts. I'm more comfortable using 4 out of my 20 spots on tight end than 4 out of 18 like it is on Underdog.
It's more viable because you have more picks to play with. And again, those running back wide receivers at that point in the draft are long shots. But I will say in the half PPR format, falling into the end zone, which tight ends tend to do, is worth a little bit more relatively. You're not going to get a ton of volume from these guys.
Yep. And one thing to note as well is, hey, when we talk about drafting in June versus drafting in August, in the 18th round, Leone mentioned Tyler Conklin. You've got Hayden Hurst that's always available. These are the starters. These are the ones that we are very confident are going to be on the team and still strongly confident are going to be the starter. You compare to the other 17th and 18th rounders right now, and these are guys that may not even be in the team. They may not be in the field. They may be game day inactives. Yeah. Come August, we're going to have more confidence in who those backup running backs are, who's actually running in 3 wide sets. That's when I'm more like, okay, I don't want to waste my 17th, 18th, because I can actually get a legitimate player that has substantial upside. But in June, I don't know. Just let me go 15, 16, 17, 18 with 4 tight ends, and all those other picks I can now focus on reaching for those actual high upside wide receiver running backs and QBs.
Yeah, I'd throw a couple other micro guys into the mix at this stage if you're employing the strategy. Gerald Everett, I think, has a pretty good role coming for the Chargers, and I throw Irv Smith into the mix as well. I know he goes a little bit earlier. The deep guys, Trey McBride, Isaiah Likely, Jelani Woods would be like the deep guys that I think are okay at tight end. Okay.
Isaiah Likely, that's a great one for a 4 tight end build because he has the ability to actually give you those true spike weeks given an injury, and he's not going to hurt you because you've got 3 others.
Exactly. Love Likely. Okay. Second concept I want to cover is what to do after you get an elite tight end and maybe also an elite quarterback. So let's say you start a draft with Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews. What does your strategy look like from there? Commonly, the most the one that makes sense to most people, and the one that I would think is if I take Kelce, if I take Mark Andrews, I'm just going to take another dusty tight end late in the draft because if Travis Kelce fails, I'm dead anyways. I've been thinking about this though, and with the help of Herzig and Leone, and I think that might not be right. So Herzig, I'll let you go first on this one too. How to handle elite quarterback or elite tight end drafts that you start with.
Yeah, so let's use the tight end example, and we can consider, I'm going to say for this argument, elite is anyone that is, hey, Pitts and Goddard all the way up. So those ones that are really drafting like, hey, top 5, top 6 round capital. A lot of the times you're like, hey, I drafted a great one. I don't want to draft more than one other one, especially if you're doing Kelce or Mark Andrews. But given the structure of these playoffs, I think there's actually an argument for, no, I do actually want to find a second tight end that can hit, whether I'm overspending and getting another high ADP one, or whether I use 2 slots later on. Because let's consider you have Kelce. You think, what's the best case scenario for you is he has an amazing year. He blows everyone else out of the water. He advances you to the playoffs. He's probably a really high advance rate player, maybe 30, 40, 50, 60%. Then you need him to carry you through those 2 playoff rounds, being 1 out of 16 to get to the finals. Best case scenario for you, if your other tight end really is nothing, is you get to the finals with Kelce, and he's still going to have an extremely high ownership. The real value is if you have one of these elite tight ends that can have that week-breaking upside, but they have a meh or an okay regular season, they're not the highest advance rate, or they come playoff time and they really just put up a dud. If you can get through that regular season with, hey, 2 late tight ends that maybe kind of blossom, or 2 late tight ends that are able to kind of, piecemeal together enough of a playoff upside, enough of those playoff advances, so you get to, as Pat Carine did, George Kittle at very low owned. If you can get to week 17 with a low owned Kelce, with a low owned Mark Andrews or Hawkinson, now that has specific unique value for these tournaments.
This is, Leone, the type of week 17 stuff that I like, because it's so frustrating to get to the final and have, Travis Kelce or Justin Jefferson. That's great. Josh Jacobs. Everybody has them. There's no, having them in the final sucks. I want to have a horrible team in the finals. And this is a way, I think, and this one, I really like this one because that makes a ton of sense to me. You'll actually get to the final and rooting for your Kelce to fail, rooting for your Andrews to fail, and then you hope a low-owned tight end that you also have on your team hits. That, to me, that is awesome week 17 strategy. Leone, what do you think?
Yeah, if you're going purely advanced rate, you're only going to take, a tight end late, like you said, with Kelce. But Justin said there's some advantage to doing that. What I like to do in my drafts in general is just be really flexible. Talked about a little bit with the 4 tight end stuff, but I had a draft where I took Hawkinson, who I don't normally take because he fell half a round after ADP, and then Kyle Pitts fell full round after ADP, and I took him. And sometimes early in my drafts, I'll do things that, structurally speaking, aren't maybe the best things to do, but I want to take advantage of that value. And that gives you some of the playoff uniqueness that Justin talks about. And it also gives me a chance to have the best version of a 2 elite tight end team, because I'm only doing it in these situations where I'm getting the incredible value. So just being really flexible in your drafts, especially early on. And, at some points in time, it's fine to take the best player available and make it work, throughout the rest of your draft. That's part of the fun of drafting these best ball teams, is based on where your draft capital is. You can kind of figure out the smartest way to make your whole team come together.
All right. Advanced concept 3 is handcuffs. Now, a lot of people would say in best ball, you want to give yourself 2 chances to hit big. So you would not want, say, Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. You would not want Nick Chubb and Jerome Ford, stuff like that, because most likely only one of them is going to hit. You're going to have a dead spot. However, I know you've done a lot of research on this, Leone. I think you found that it is viable to roster handcuffs in best ball. That's a bit counterintuitive, I think, to a lot of people also. Go ahead on handcuffs.
Yeah, I think the data is a little bit murky overall, and I'd like to see the sample size expanded from what I did. But what I found was if you can find these backfields that aren't overly expensive and have guys that sort of have like dual roles, those in particular are pretty strong. Or just taking two guys late in an ambiguous backfield where we're not sure who the starter is exactly. And because of that uncertainty, the cost on all the backs are pretty cheap. So the dual role backfields, you can think of an Aaron Jones, AJ Dillon from a year ago, where Aaron Jones is more of your pass catcher, big play guy. AJ Dillon, I mean, there's some overlap, but he's more of like the 2-down bruiser, a little bit more touchdown upside. And what that allows you to do is if both guys, you get them at a good value, they can both pay off their tag without one getting hurt. So you have that contingent value if they get hurt, but you also have the ability, if it's a negative game script game and Aaron Jones is catching a ton of passes, you get him that week. If it's a positive game script game, then maybe AJ Dillon is the guy that week. And I think that helps in the regular season to smooth out the distributions a little bit. Now that's me just guessing there. I don't have the data to prove that, but we definitely know in the playoff weeks, again, the uniqueness thing where, maybe there aren't a lot of AJ Dillon, Aaron Jones teams because people don't want to pair them together. And then it's AJ Dillon one week, Aaron Jones the next week. That might not be the perfect example because I know those guys overlap skill sets some, but you get that. And then you get the ambiguous backfields where people don't know who the starter is, or you get a Miami Dolphins backfield where you got three backs with an ADP in the double-digit rounds, and there's a lot of weekly upside in that backfield. We just don't know which one it is. So you can get a couple of those backs.
Yeah. And the different roles one, I think is a clear one. Like you can obviously take, I think, Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery on the same team, right? Like Jahmyr Gibbs could catch 70 balls and David Montgomery can score 12 touchdowns. I'm curious what you think about guys with kind of the same role though, or more dependent on an injury. In other words, like I like Jerome Ford as a late round pick, but it's going to be hard for him to find usable weeks, I think, if Nick Chubb is healthy. So would you have Nick Chubb and Jerome Ford on the same team?
I usually wouldn't. I don't like the straight handcuffs because I'm really betting on that lead guy having that important elite season. Some people, again, will make the playoff uniqueness argument where it's like, well, what if Chubb misses a week and then you get Ford and you get Chubb through? I personally find that to be a little bit thin. So I don't like the pure handcuff situations, especially if it's a back in the first 2 or 3 rounds.
Okay. Herzig, anything to add on handcuffs here?
Yeah, for me, I want either ambiguity or a second player that has an established role. I think the sneaky correlation aspect that's not really covered is we're used to running backs not correlating, inversely correlating in a DFS mindset, because really only one of those is going to get the touchdowns to get the majority of the work. Across the season, they can actually positively correlate on a couple different factors. One of those is this team is actually more efficient than we expect. Think Carolina, think Houston this year. Rookie QBs, but maybe that team's actually really good. Maybe they're a bit more run heavy than we're actually projecting. And this team has a great offensive line, great ground game. So across the season, both backs can actually do well there. Then there's what if it's a 3-headed backfield and we're wrong about one of those players? New Orleans and Miami are the two that come to mind for me where, hey, if you want to make a bet that Alvin Kamara doesn't actually play this year, suspended a whole year, you draft the other two in that backfield, Kendra Miller and Jamal Williams, and those are both going to surpass ADP value and be hits. Same thing in Miami. Maybe you think that Devin A. Shane is not actually going to be that good. He's too small. Maybe there's an injury even. And those other two backs, Jeff Wilson and Raheem Mostert, end up being huge hits.
Okay. This next one, concept 4, is in the handcuffing family, but I think it's interesting, stacking without the quarterback. And I know you've done this in DFS, Leone. I think it strikes me as somewhat intuitive in DFS, where you can take a cheap quarterback and try to get the same points. On DraftKings specifically, your pass catchers start to rack up catches and they score a bunch of points, but not necessarily the quarterback doesn't go off with them, when you can find a cheaper quarterback to give you the same amount of points. In best ball, I think it's a little bit more counterintuitive. So what do you think about stacking without quarterback in best ball, Leone?
Yeah, I think it comes down to a couple of things. One, the distribution of points. An offense like Jacksonville, we're expecting them to be a bit more up tempo, throw a decent bit, and really concentrated in terms of where the targets go. So there's an opportunity for multiple pass catchers to hit in that offense. And that could happen without Trevor Lawrence having like an absolutely insane season, especially if he's not like crazy efficient. It's just a lot of pass volume to the right guy. So one aspect of it is the distribution of points. The other aspect is just like the quarterback is often the least important part of a stack in terms of like how you're separating on a given week. And that's not always the case, but we can see, situations where, Trevor Lawrence scores 24 points and the pass catchers go off, but there's a lot of other quarterbacks that are pretty close to that score. So we can still invest in the offense without having to be tied to that quarterback. In best ball, I'm assuming the quarterbacks you do take are correlated though. So it's not like we want to take uncorrelated quarterbacks. In some ways, it's just a way to get even more correlation into your lineup without over investing into the quarterback position. And you can see that maybe in the playoff weeks, 15, 16, 17, you've got a stack with, two Jacksonville players and a bring back. That game goes off and you're really covered there. And then your quarterback just scores like somewhat close to Lawrence, or maybe that stack hits as well.
Right. And what Leone is saying is you could take like CeeDee Lamb, Pollard, and Cooks and not have Dak, but you have a Dallas stack, and then you get stacks elsewhere at quarterback, creating 3 stacks instead of just 2 with your quarterbacks. Herzig, any thoughts on stacking without the quarterback?
Yeah, I'm more willing to target this with late wide receivers or pass catchers, because let's say you do let's say we use Jamar Chase and T. Higgins. For those 2 to be hits, both going off like in big games for the season, Joe Burrow also has to have a huge year. But if we're talking about guys like, I don't know, maybe on the we can go Giants or something, where you pick 2 of those pass catchers that are costing you very little. Daniel Jones doesn't have to have a huge passing year for you to need him. And maybe you actually drafted an elite QB early on. That's going to be your QB for that, for most weeks, but you can still hit on these late wide receivers that positively correlate because something else in their offense, it's pass heavy, it's clicking. I'll also say I'm more willing to do this on DK than underdog, because DraftKings, your wide receivers can really stack up points just with those receptions, which a reception really doesn't help your quarterback.
Yep. Okay. Number 5 is an interesting one to me. So there's been so much talk about week 17 and week 17 stacking. One concept that is not covered very much in week 17 stacking is quarterbacks from the same game. Herzig, I know you've thought about this a lot. When you're talking about week 17 stacks, how do you think about the quarterback position?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there was a buzz that was created because I put out a kind of controversial tweet saying that it is suboptimal to draft 2 QBs from the same week 17 game. And now this is not you should absolutely never do it, but it's another kind of consideration. And the argument behind it is if you have 2 QBs from the same game, you are missing out on potential other blowout games while getting 2 QBs that are highly correlated. Meaning in one game, if one QB does really well, it's likely that other QB also does well. So there's no point in owning them both. But in the inverse, they're negatively correlated, where if it's a bad game, both are probably going to do poorly, and you're missing out on, oh, maybe I could have had more, bites out of the pie or whatever the saying might be, but getting more pieces from another game.
Yeah, just diversifying your week 17 portfolio, give you access to more games that go off. That makes sense to me. Leone, any thoughts on this 2 QBs from the same game in week 17?
Yeah, I had a team where I think in hindsight I made a mistake, but I had a Josh Allen stack with a few New England players, and I needed a late quarterback too. And it was like, do I take Mac Jones because I have 3 Patriots players as part of this week 17 game stack, or do I take CJ Stroud because I have 1 Houston player? And I ended up going with the larger stack, the season long correlation with Mac Jones. But I think CJ Stroud might have been the play there, because if that New England Buffalo game goes off, I mean, what are the odds that the difference in me winning is Mac Jones outscoring Josh Allen by the X amount of points, right? That is needed. It's such a unlikely outcome, whereas if that game tanks and I have, CJ Stroud has an outlier good game and that offense just clicks more than we think, even though it's a smaller stack for me overall, I've got that second out. So everything Justin said makes a ton of sense to me. I know it's counterintuitive to people because you're thinking these huge game stacks got to get the quarterbacks, but only one of them can count is right. The big difference there.
One thing that I would say is that your advance rate was probably better if you take Mac Jones there, right? Because you already have 3 New England pass catchers, so your advance rate is going to be better.
Yeah, that was a tough one. I guess I'm still not sure what the correct choice was there.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think the difference would be is if you would have planned ahead of time and said, I'm not going to stack New England, I'm not going to take 3 pass catchers. One of those third pass catchers may have then been a Houston player. And now going CJ Stroud and Houston is the better play.
Right. Okay. Concept number 6, second to last one we're going to cover is bye weeks. And this one, it gets people crazy. I mean, even in season long, which it's absolutely insane to me in season long to worry about bye weeks because so much is going to happen with injuries and waivers. I mean, when I draft a season long team, I don't even think about bye weeks. In best ball, I understand that people need to look at bye weeks, obviously, because you don't want to show up for a week where you have 6 of your 8 wide receivers on bye or all 3 of your quarterbacks on bye. I know you've looked at this, Leone. There is a lot of bye week back and forth out there. I feel like that's not as toxic as the week 17 stuff, but I feel like the bye week bros, it can get toxic between the anti-bye week and the pro-bye week people out there in the streets. What do you think about bye weeks?
Yeah, I think, Neil Farley on Twitter at Feel Gnarly looked at this a little bit. And I guess even just zooming out, the argument for not caring about bye weeks is that you just want such a strong team that giving up a few points during a bye week doesn't really matter. And I think what Neil found is for finishing first in your league, there's quite often like a pretty big gap between the team that finishes first and second. But for between finishing second and third, that gap a lot of times is like a crappy tight end game, and that's where we're talking about wanting to have different bye weeks so that we're not completely conceding points. So I think it's something where you don't want to go overboard and be like, oh, I need all different bye weeks for my players. Like that's insane. But you also don't want to be on the extreme where, you've drafted 5 running backs and 3 of them have the same bye week. I mean, even that might be like, okay, but like you want 4 of them with the same bye week. Like at that point, you need to differentiate. You don't want to just concede those points off the bat. And especially with the way the playoff structure works, Adam, as you said, sometimes it's like, hey, I want the worst team in the playoffs possible, right? Like, so you do want these outs where maybe you don't have a super team and you squeeze into the playoffs in that number 2. So I think the theory that like, well, if my team's good enough to win the turn, the Best Ball Mania 4, the bye weeks aren't going to matter. Like, I don't think that's true, because of the randomness in the playoff weeks. So I do think it's important. There might be times where if you're getting really good value on 2 tight ends that share the same bye week, and the rest of the market's not going to take 2 tight ends like that share the same bye week, you can get some uniqueness in the tournament. So like there's some times that you can play with it a little bit, but a lot of this is just common sense. Like just don't go overboard one way or the other.
Yeah. And the point you made about sneaking into the playoffs, like, yeah, I want to sneak into the playoffs. That's exactly what I want. I want to sneak into the playoffs with the worst possible team. And by having some bye week stack, maybe you can do that in some ways. Herzig, any bye week thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general idea of, hey, just, stay away from the extremes makes the most sense. You really don't want zeros in your lineup. Those hurt you the most. Just getting someone out there to get those points is helpful. I think the rule number 1 is QBs. You do not want to take a 0 at QB. So if you're playing only 2 QBs in the same bye week, like it's worth using an 18th round, 7th round pick to grab a third QB. Running backs, wide receivers, Leone said, yeah, just don't go crazy on it. Tight ends, I will say, I'm a proponent of if you are taking 2 tight ends, there's nothing wrong with them being the same bye week. I did some analysis back on this, and on average, you're losing around 4 to 6 points if you're going to be, hey, just throwing in a late tight end that has a different bye week. Obviously, you don't want to be overspending. What Leone said, though, if we want to get a little micro and get a little crazy this year, here are the ones that I like. Week 10 buys, you have Travis Kelce and Dallas Goedert. Week 13, you have Mark Andrews, TJ Hawkinson, and Darren Waller. Those are combinations within the bye weeks that are going to be extremely low owned. So if you want to make a unique lineup and draft Kelce and Goddard, you can either A, draft another late 18th round tight end that's a different bye week, or just accept those 2, accept that you're giving up a little points early on, but maybe those 2 in week 17 actually both go off, or they ping pong going off in the playoffs. That's going to be a unique build.
Yes. All right. Last one is an age-old question, Leone. As we sit here in June with only peak virgins drafting, there will be drafts from now and the previous month all the way up until literally the day before kickoff, I believe, Best Ball Mania filled last year. So people are going to ask, okay, well, when is the best time to draft? Should I be drafting early or should I be drafting late? And we've talked about this so much. We've looked at all this. I'm not sure there's actually a definitive answer. My bull case for drafting now is that you can get some outrageous ADP values. I mean, we just ripped off huge ADP values on Alexander Mattison and Marquise Brown and Rondale Moore if you were using our rankings. You will not be able to get that in September. My argument for drafting in September is we are going to be facing casuals, people who are never even heard of this podcast or any of these concepts that we're talking about. The field will be way, way, way weaker, and therefore we should be able to build some really good teams that way. Leone, do you think there is an optimal time of year to draft?
I think like roughly around July is the best time to draft. And zooming out, the reason why, the biggest components, you hit on it, being able to get that closing line value on players. When I say closing line value, basically looking at where their final ADP is and the difference between that and where you drafted a player. So if you drafted a player at pick 30 and their final ADP is pick 20, you got 10 spots of closing line ADP value. And I looked at all teams last year, and the teams that were in the top 10% of most closing line value had about a 50% increase in their regular season advance rate. So going from 16.7% to around 24%. That's massive. And even in that second bucket, 10th to 20th percentile was about a little bit more than a 25% increase. So it is a really big deal to be able to get that closing line ADP value. And if you look at the odds of achieving that, if you draft in May or June, you are much more likely to be getting one of those top 10% teams on a relative basis than if you draft in August or September. So but the flip side of this is if you start looking at the number of live players come the playoff weeks, and when I say live players, I mean players on your roster that are just contributing more than 0 points. Doesn't mean if they're good or not, just players who aren't dead, players who aren't benched, they are not hurt. That has a huge impact on your expected value come playoff time. Like really, really important, and even throughout the regular season. And makes sense. The closer you draft to the season, the less likely you are to have dead players on your roster. One, because there's less time for guys to get hurt. But two, we just have more information, especially in terms of those late round guys, in terms of what they're doing. So July is sort of that middle ground where you still have time to get that high-end closing line ADP value. And we start to get some more information where we're not getting as many. The amount of dead players is sort of like even. Like you're going to get a lot more dead players if you draft in May or June. You're going to get a lot less if you draft in August and September. So that's why I think like roughly around July, but you can use some critical thinking, just understanding the factors that go into this.
One factor that I personally consider for me is that I'm trying to play higher stakes, small field stuff. I don't think there's many casuals firing up the 5-5-5 on DraftKings. You know what I mean? Like in June, right? And so I think I'm personally for that stuff more likely to wait later. I don't know, Justin. I know you've been firing into some of those higher stakes stuff. What do you think about when to draft for the BBM and for the lottos and stuff like that? If I was making a bunch, I would definitely try to get some from all buckets. June bucket, July bucket, and probably more in August and September. But yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for the higher stakes, I also don't think you're going to have many casuals drafting the 5-5-5 in August or September either, just because of that high price point.
Agree to disagree, but go ahead.
It's okay. We get auto drafts now, like 2 out of every 12 drafters right now, because they forget because it's June. Right. Honestly, I mean, I think everything that Leone said makes a lot of sense, but in reality, like your edge in gaining is really not that much, and everything else that we're focusing on. I take this more of like a, quality of life standpoint. If you got some time to draft and you want to draft, go draft. If you enjoy fast drafts more than slow drafts, do fast drafts. If slow drafts fit your life better, go with those. Like, I think that there are so many other things that can impact your success with your teams that focusing on, I'm only going to draft at this time because I think this is the optimal. I'm going to do it Friday night at 10 p.m. because that's when the drunk frat boys are all drafting. Like, do what's best for you. This is supposed to all be fun. This still is kind of a huge maybe slightly weighted lottery ticket. So do what's best.
Yeah. You mentioned the fast draft for slow draft. I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on that. I always try to do fast draft because of people timing out, people going on auto draft, people panicking when they're on the clock. They're not as prepared as us. I always struck me that fast draft would be just anecdotally, I figured fast draft would be way softer, but I saw some data that maybe fast draft for slow draft, there's not a huge difference. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, either of you.
When I looked at the fast drafts versus slow drafts, fast drafts are definitely softer, but kind of like Justin was saying in terms of the actual impact at the end of the day, it wasn't a huge difference. And from quality of life standpoint, again, I know Justin's very anti slow drafts, but if you're someone like me who I'd much rather check my phone like 3 times a day for 5 minutes each than sit and spend an hour drafting. There wasn't enough evidence to me to say like you're way behind if you draft slow drafts. So I'm drafting slow drafts. And also to Justin's point, like ADPs are going to change over the course of the summer. And sometimes it's fun to be able to, get different exposures to different players at different prices. I think that's important to keep in mind as far as, when you're choosing to draft. And also we talked about the 4 tight end stuff, but if you do think about the components that go into it, our issue early on is like drafting too many dead players. We can counteract that and like maybe get the closing line ADP value and reduce our odds of dead players by maybe we have more 3 quarterback teams early when we know the quarterback late are actually starting, or we mess around with the 4 tight end teams now and we're reducing our odds of dead players, still getting our chance to get that huge ADP value. Then we switch it up closer to the season. We go more on like, okay, I'll take, elite quarterback, just take 2 quarterbacks, 2 tight ends. And because my lottery tickets at running back and wide receiver have improved substantially now that it's August.
Yep. All right. I think people who are deep in the best ball streets will very much enjoy this episode. Appreciate you all being here as best ball summer descends upon our souls. Don't forget, we are indeed here to help. Be sure you're following at Justin Herzig, at 2 Hats 1 Mike, at Adam Levitan, at Establish the Run on Twitter. We are here for all your best ball needs. Again, hope you really enjoyed this series. We had a lot of fun doing it. For Leone, for Herzig, for producer Luke, I am Adam. Good luck, everybody.